Now, this implies that the tomb was empty, because for the earliest Palestinian Christians, their Jewish background made a resurrection without an empty tomb kind of meaningless. Secondly, the empty tomb story is part of very old source material used by Mark. So then, once again, given Paul and Mark, we have here another example of multiple independent early sources talking about the same fact. Finally, the fact that women's testimony was virtually worthless in first century Palestine counts in favor of the women's role in discovering the empty tomb. You see, women had a second-class status in first century Palestine. The Jewish historian Josephus says women were unable to serve as witnesses in a Jewish court. So it's kind of amazing that women should appear in these stories as the chief witnesses to Jesus' empty tomb. An unreliable woman witness would have been an embarrassment to the Christian proclamation. The fact that they included the woman's testimony anyway strongly suggests that it really happened. All right then, let me move on to fact 3. On multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. Now, it's important to note here that the only thing this third fact is saying is that people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. So a skeptic about the resurrection could agree with this third fact and then try to explain away the experiences of these people as hallucinations, like in the movie A Beautiful Mind, where Russell Crowe's character sees people that are not there at all. Or a skeptic about the resurrection could agree with this third fact and then try to explain away the experiences of these people as seeing the disembodied spirit of Jesus, like in the movie Sixth Sense, where the child character says to Bruce Willis's character, "I see dead people." My own favorite version of this sort of skeptical explanation is what one author calls the Jedi Jesus view, because it says that people experience Jesus in the same way that Luke Skywalker experienced the 3 Jedis at the very end of the movie The Return of the Jedi. Luke is able to see the spirits of his father Anakin, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Yoda, but Luke's sister Leia cannot see any of these Jedis. Anyhow, researchers have established this third fact on the basis of several strands of evidence. For one thing, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances that is quoted by Paul in that first letter to the Corinthians guarantees that such experiences or such appearances occurred. You see, among the witnesses of the resurrection appearances that Paul lists are Peter, the immediate circle of the disciples known as the 12, a gathering of 500 Christian believers, many of whom Paul evidently knew, since Paul was aware that some had died by the time of his writing, Jesus' younger brother James, who was apparently not yet a follower of Jesus at that time, a wider group of apostles, and finally, to top off the list, Paul says, last of all, Jesus appeared to me, even at a time when Paul was a leading persecutor of the early Christian movement. So, it's almost universally accepted on the basis of the early date of Paul's information, as well as Paul's personal acquaintance with many of the people that he lists, that the disciples did experience post-mortem appearances of Jesus. But there's more here. The appearance traditions in the Gospels provide some multiple independent sources of these appearances. A couple examples. The appearance to Peter is independently mentioned by both Paul and Luke in his Gospel. The appearance to the 12 is independently mentioned by Paul, Luke, and John. Now, this matters because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the main tests that New Testament scholars often use to improve their confidence in the authenticity or historicity of a given event is the test of there being multiple independent sources which mention that event. All right then, let me move on to fact number 4. The original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite their having every reason not to. Think about the situation of the original disciples the day after the crucifixion. Their leader was dead, and Jews had no belief in a dying Messiah, much less a rising Messiah. In Jewish expectation, the Messiah would conquer Israel's enemies, not be executed by them. So Jesus' execution at the hands of Rome was a disproof to a first century Jew that Jesus was not Israel's awaited Messiah, but another failed pretender. You see, messianic movements that failed were nothing new in first century Judaism, and they left their followers with two main options: either go home or find a new Messiah. A second consideration relevant here is that Jewish beliefs about the afterlife in the first century made it unthinkable that anyone could rise from the dead before the general resurrection at the end of the world. You see, Jewish hope in the resurrection of the dead was invariably a corporate hope, and a hope for the end of the world. For example, in the Gospels themselves, when Jesus assures Martha that her brother Lazarus will rise again, Martha responds, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." So then, the four facts to be explained are these. After his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. On the Sunday following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. On multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. And the original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite their having every reason not to. Now it's time for me to defend the second part of my argument, that the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now the obvious question that comes up whenever you're trying to use this pattern of reasoning known as inference to the best explanation is this: just what are the tests or criteria that we should use to help us pick from the pool of live options? Now, as you can imagine, books have been written trying to answer this question. So what I'd like to do this evening is to give you a helpful way of thinking about inference to the best explanation when you're dealing with historical facts, and to give you a quick illustration of how the resurrection hypothesis, the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead, meshes with this approach. So in his book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, historian C.D. McCullough lists several tests that historians often use to determine the best explanation for given historical facts. The first test is whether a hypothesis has great explanatory scope. The basic idea is whether a hypothesis can explain a lot of the facts that need to be explained, or only a few of the facts that need to be explained. So take my jury example. My jury considered the hypothesis the defendant committed the robbery able to explain the testimony of the victims, the ATM and cell phone records, the photographs by the security cameras, and a number of other facts in the case. The second test is whether a hypothesis has great explanatory power. The basic idea here is whether a hypothesis can do a powerful job explaining those facts that it does try to explain. So even if it only tries to explain 1 out of 5 facts, how powerful a job does it do in explaining that one fact? For example, in the jury case, the defendant committed the robbery hypothesis did a powerful job of explaining why the photograph taken at the ATM machine looked so very much like the defendant. A third test is whether a hypothesis is plausible. The basic idea here is whether we know things that disprove the hypothesis. Take the jury case again. The hypothesis that someone could be with a relative several hundred miles away at 8 o'clock at night and then be back here to commit a robbery at 9 o'clock at night without even using a plane is disproven by things that we know about how fast someone can travel by car. A fourth test is whether a hypothesis is contrived. The basic idea here is that a theory becomes increasingly contrived in proportion to the number of additional assumptions that it requires us to adopt. For example, during our deliberations in the jury, someone actually seriously suggested that the defendant might have committed the robbery but used a fake gun from Hollywood rather than a real gun. This explanation was somewhat contrived because it required us to assume, among other things, that someone interested in committing a petty theft would have access to a fake gun from Hollywood, and that they would want to bring a fake gun to carry out a real robbery. Think about it. What would the robber do if the victim pulled out a real gun? The fifth test is whether a